Section 2 of A Little Tour of France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. I have mentioned the church of Saint Martin, which was for many years the sacred spot, the shrine of pilgrimage of Tours. Originally the simple burial place of the great apostle who in the 4th century Christianized Gaul, and who in his day, a brilliant missionary and worker of miracles, is chiefly known to modern fame as the worthy that cut his cloak in two at the gate of Amiens to share it with a beggar. Tradition fails to say, I believe, what he did with the other half. The abbey of Saint Martin through the Middle Ages waxed rich and powerful, till it was known at last as one of the most luxurious religious houses in Christendom, with kings for its titular abbots, who, like Francis I, sometimes turned and despoiled it, and a great treasure of precious things. It passed, however, through many vicissitudes. Pillaged by the Normans in the 9th century and by the Huguenots in the 16th, it received its death blow from the Revolution, which must have brought to bear upon it an energy of destruction proportionate to its mighty bulk. At the end of the last century a huge group of ruins alone remained, and what we see today may be called the ruin of a ruin. It is difficult to understand how so vast an edifice can have been so completely obliterated. Its site is given up to several ugly streets, and a pair of tall towers, separated by a space which speaks volumes as to the size of the church, and looking across the close-pressed roofs to the happier spires of the cathedral, preserved for the modern world the memory of a great fortune, a great abuse perhaps, and at all events a great penalty. One may believe that to this day a considerable part of the foundations of the great abbey is buried in the soil of Tours. The two surviving towers, which are dissimilar in shape, are enormous. With those of the cathedral they form the great landmarks of the town. One of them bears the name of the Tour de l'Horloge. The other, the so-called Tour Charlemagne, was erected 2 centuries after her death, over the tomb of Luitgarde, wife of the great emperor, who died at Tours in 800. I do not pretend to understand in what relation these very mighty and effectually detached masses of masonry stood to each other, but in their grey elevation and loneliness they are striking and suggestive today, holding their hoary heads far above the modern life of the town, and looking sad and conscious as they had outlived all uses. I know not what is supposed to have become of the bones of the blessed saint during the various scenes of confusion in which they may have got mislaid, but a mystic connection with his wonder-working relics may be perceived in a strange little sanctuary on the left of the street, which opens in front of the Tour Charlemagne, the rugged base of which, by the way, inhabited like a cave, with a diminutive doorway, in which, as I passed, an old woman stood cleaning a pot, and a little dark window decorated with homely flowers, would be appreciated by a painter in search of bits. The present shrine of Saint Martin is enclosed, provisionally I suppose, in a very modern structure of timber, where, in a dusky cellar, to which you descend by a wooden staircase adorned with votive tablets and paper roses, is placed a tabernacle surrounded by twinkling tapers and prostrate worshippers. Even this crepuscular vault, however, fails, I think, to attain solemnity, for the whole place is strangely vulgar and garish. The Catholic Church, as churches go to-day, is certainly the most spectacular, but it must feel that it has a great fund of impressiveness to draw upon when it opens such sordid little shops of sanctity as this. It is impossible not to be struck with the grotesqueness of such an establishment as the last link in the chain of a great ecclesiastical tradition. In the same street, on the other side, a little below, is something better worth your visit than the shrine of Saint Martin. Knock at a high door in a white wall, there is a cross above it, and a fresh-faced sister of the convent of the Petit Saint Martin will let you into the charming little cloister, or rather fragment of a cloister. Only one side of this exquisite structure remains, but the whole place is effective. In front of the beautiful arcade, which is terribly bruised and obliterated, is one of those walks of interlaced tilleuls which are so frequent in Touraine, and into which the green light filters so softly through a lattice of clipped twigs. Beyond this is a garden, and beyond the garden are the other buildings of the convent, where the placid sisters keep a school, a test, doubtless, of placidity. The imperfect arcade, which dates from the beginning of the 16th century, I know nothing of it but what is related in Mrs. Patterson's Renaissance in France, is a truly enchanting piece of work, the cornice and the angles of the arches being covered with the daintiest sculpture of arabesques, flowers, fruit medallions, cherubs, griffins, all in the finest and most attenuated relief. It is like the chasing of a bracelet in stone. The taste, the fancy, the elegance, the refinement, are of those things which revive our standard of the exquisite. Such a piece of work is the purest flower of the French Renaissance. There is nothing more delicate in all Touraine. There is another fine thing at Tours which is not particularly delicate, but which makes a great impression, the very interesting old church of Saint Julien, lurking in a crooked corner at the right of the Rue Royale, near the point at which this indifferent thoroughfare emerges, with its little cry of admiration, on the bank of the Loire. Saint Julien stands today in a kind of neglected hollow, where it is much shut in by houses, but in the year 1225, when the edifice was begun, the site was doubtless, as the architects say, more eligible. At present, indeed, when once you have caught a glimpse of the stout, serious Romanesque tower, which is not high but strong, you feel that the building has something to say, and that you must stop to listen to it. Within, it has a vast and splendid nave, of immense height, the nave of a cathedral, with a shallow choir and transepts, and some admirable old glass. I spent half an hour there one morning, listening to what the church had to say, in perfect solitude. Not a worshipper entered, not even an old man with a broom. I have always thought there is a sex in fine buildings, and Saint Julien, with its noble nave, is of the gender of the name of its patron. It was that same morning, I think, that I went in search of the old houses of Tours, for the town contains several goodly specimens of the domestic architecture of the past. The dwelling to which the average Anglo-Saxon will most probably direct his steps, and the only one I have space to mention, is the so-called Maison de Tristan l'Hermite, a gentleman whom the readers of Quentin Durward will not have forgotten, the hangman in ordinary to the great King Louis XI. Unfortunately, the house of Tristan is not the house of Tristan at all. This illusion has been cruelly dispelled. There are no illusions left at all in the good city of Tours with regard to Louis XI. His terrible castle of Plessis, the picture of which sends a shiver through the youthful reader of Scott, has been reduced to suburban insignificance, and the residence of his triste compere, on the front of which a festooned rope figures as a motive for decoration, is observed to have been erected in the succeeding century. The Maison de Tristan may be visited for itself, however, if not for Walter Scott. It is an exceedingly picturesque old facade, to which you pick your way through a narrow and tortuous street, a street terminating a little beyond it in the walk beside the river. An elegant Gothic doorway is let into the rusty red brickwork, and strange little beasts crouch at the angles of the windows, which are surmounted by a tall graduated gable, pierced with a small orifice, where the large surface of brick, lifted out of the shadow of the street, looks yellow and faded. The whole thing is disfigured and decayed, but it is a capital subject for a sketch in colors. Only I must wish the sketcher better luck or a better temper than my own. If he ring the bell to be admitted to see the court, which I believe is more sketchable still, let him have patience to wait till the bell is answered. He can do the outside while they are coming. The Maison de Tristan, I say, may be visited for itself, but I hardly know what the remnants of Plessis-Tours may be visited for. To reach them you wander through crooked suburban lanes, down the course of the Loire, to a rough, undesirable, incongruous spot, where a small, crude building of red brick is pointed out to you by your cabman, if you happen to drive, as the romantic abode of a superstitious king, and where a strong odor of pigsties and other unclean things so prostrates you for the moment that you have no energy to protest against the obvious fiction. You enter a yard encumbered with rubbish and a defiant dog, and an old woman emerges from a shabby lodge and assures you that you are indeed in an historic place. The red brick building, which looks like a small factory, rises on the ruins of the favourite residence of the dreadful Louis. It is now occupied by a company of night scavengers, whose huge carts are drawn up in a row before it. I know not whether this be what is called the irony of fate. At any rate, the effect of it is to accentuate strongly the fact, and through the most susceptible of our senses, that there is no honour for the authors of great wrongs. The dreadful Louis is reduced simply to an offence to the nostrils. The old woman shows you a few fragments, several dark, damp, much encumbered vaults, denominated dungeons, and an old tower staircase in good condition. There are the outlines of the old moat. There is also the outline of the old guard-room, which is now a stable. And there are other vague outlines and inconsequent lumps, which I have forgotten. You need all your imagination, and even then you cannot make out that Plessis was a castle of large extent, though the old woman, as your eye wanders over the neighbouring potager, talks a good deal about the gardens and the park. The place looks mean and flat, and as you drive away you scarcely know whether to be glad or sorry that all those bristling horrors have been reduced to the commonplace. A certain flatness of impression awaits you also, I think, at Marmoutier, which is the other indispensable excursion in the near neighbourhood of Tours. The remains of this famous abbey lie on the other bank of the stream, about 1.5 miles from the town. You follow the edge of the big brown river. Of a fine afternoon you will be glad to go further still. The abbey has gone the way of most abbeys, but the place is a restoration as well as a ruin, inasmuch as the Sisters of the Sacred Heart have erected a terribly modern convent here. A large Gothic doorway in a high fragment of ancient wall admits you to a garden-like enclosure of great extent, from which you are further introduced into an extraordinarily tidy little parlour, where 2 good nuns sit at work. One of these came out with me, and showed me over the place, a very definite little woman, with pointed features, an intensely distinct enunciation, and those pretty manners which, for whatever other teachings it may be responsible, the Catholic Church so often instills into its functionaries. I have never seen a woman who had got her lesson better than this little trotting, murmuring, edifying nun. The interest of Marmoutier to-day is not so much an interest of vision, so to speak, as an interest of reflection, that is, if you choose to reflect, for instance, upon the wondrous legend of the 7 sleepers, you may see where they lie in a row, who lived together. They were brothers and sisters in primitive piety in the sanctuary constructed by the blessed Saint Martin, emulous of his precursor, Saint Gatianos, in the face of the hillside that overhung the Loire, and who, 25 years after his death, yielded up their 7 souls at the same moment, and enjoyed the curious privilege of retaining in their faces, in spite of this process, the rosy tints of life. The abbey of Marmoutier, which sprung from the grottoes in the cliff to which Saint Gatianos and Saint Martin retired to pray, was therefore the creation of the latter worthy, as the other great abbey, in the town proper, was the monument of his repose. The cliff is still there, and a winding staircase, in the latest taste, enables you conveniently to explore its recesses. These sacred niches are scooped out of the rock, and will give you an impression if you cannot do without one. You will feel them to be sufficiently venerable when you learn that the particular pigeon-hole of Saint Gatianos, the first Christian missionary to Gaul, dates from the 3rd century. They have been dealt with, as the Catholic Church deals with most of such places to-day, polished and furnished up, labelled and ticketed, edited with notes, in short, like an old book. The process is a mistake; the early editions had more sanctity. The modern buildings of the Sacred Heart, on which you look down from these points of vantage, are in the vulgar taste which seems doomed to stamp itself on all new Catholic work. But there was nevertheless a great sweetness in the scene. The afternoon was lovely, and it was flushing to a close. The large garden stretched beneath us, blooming with fruit and wine and succulent vegetables, and beyond it flowed the shining river. The air was still, the shadows were long, and the place, after all, was full of memories, most of which might pass for virtuous. It certainly was better than Plessis-les-Tours. Chapter 4. Your business at Tours is to make excursions, and if you make them all you will be very well occupied. Touraine is rich in antiquities, and an hour's drive from the town in almost any direction will bring you to the knowledge of some curious fragment of domestic or ecclesiastical architecture, some turreted manor, some lonely tower, some gabled village or historic site. Even, however, if you do everything, which was not my case, you cannot hope to relate everything, and fortunately for you the excursions divide themselves into the greater and the less. You may achieve most of the greater in a week or two, but a summer in Touraine, which by the way must be a charming thing, would contain none too many days for the others. If you come down to Tours from Paris, your best economy is to spend a few days at Blois, where a clumsy but rather attractive little inn on the edge of the river will offer you a certain amount of that familiar and intermittent hospitality which a few weeks spent in the French provinces teaches you to regard as the highest attainable form of accommodation. Such an economy I was unable to practice. I could only go to Blois from Tours to spend the day, but this feat I accomplished twice over. It is a very sympathetic little town, as we say nowadays, and one might easily resign one's self to a week there. Seated on the north bank of the Loire, it presents a bright, clean face to the sun, and has that aspect of cheerful leisure which belongs to all white towns that reflect themselves in the shining waters. It is the waterfront only of Blois, however, that exhibits this fresh complexion. The interior is of a proper brownness, as befits a signally historic city. The only disappointment I had there was the discovery that the castle, which is the special object of one's pilgrimage, does not overhang the river, as I had always allowed myself to believe. It overhangs the town, but it is scarcely visible from the stream. That peculiar good fortune is reserved for Amboise and Chaumont. The Chateau de Blois is one of the most beautiful and elaborate of all the old royal residences of this part of France, and I suppose it should have all the honors of my description. As you cross its threshold you can step straight into the brilliant movement of the French Renaissance. But it is too rich to describe, I can only touch it here and there. It must be premised that in speaking of it as one sees it today, one speaks of a monument unsparingly restored. The work of restoration has been as ingenious as it is profuse, but it rather chills the imagination. This is perhaps almost the first thing you feel as you approach the castle from the streets of the town. These little streets, as they leave the river, have pretensions to romantic steepness. One of them, indeed, which resolves itself into a high staircase with divergent wings, the escalier monumental, achieved this result so successfully as to remind me vaguely, I hardly know why, of the great slope of the Capitol beside the Ara Coeli at Rome. The view of that part of the castle which figures today as the back (it is the only aspect I had seen reproduced) exhibits the marks of restoration with the greatest assurance. The long facade, consisting only of balconied windows deeply recessed, erects itself on the summit of a considerable hill, which gives a fine plunging movement to its foundations. The deep niches of the windows are all aglow with color. They have been repainted with red and blue, relieved with gold figures, and each of them looks more like the royal box at a theatre than like the aperture of a palace dark with memories. For all this, however, and in spite of the fact that, as in some of the others of the chateaux of Touraine, always excepting the colossal Chambord, which is not in Touraine, there is less vastness than one had expected, the least hospitable aspect of Blois is abundantly impressive. Here, as elsewhere, lightness and grace are the keynote, and the recesses of the windows, with their happy proportions, their sculpture and their color, are the empty frames of brilliant pictures. They need the figure of a Francis I. to complete them, or of a Diane de Poitiers, or even of a Henry III. The base of this exquisite structure emerges from a bed of light verdure, which has been allowed to mass itself there, and which contributes to the springing look of the walls, while on the right it joins the most modern portion of the castle, the building erected on foundations of enormous height and solidity in 1635 by Gaston d'Orleans. This fine, frigid mansion — the proper view of it is from the court within — is one of the masterpieces of Francois Mansart, whom a kind Providence did not allow to make over the whole palace in the superior manner of his superior age. This had been a part of Gaston's plan; he was a blunderer born, and this precious project was worthy of him. This execution of it would surely have been one of the great misdeeds of history. Partially performed, the misdeed is not altogether to be regretted; for as one stands in the court of the castle, and lets one's eye wander from the splendid wing of Francis I., which is the last work of free and joyous invention, to the ruled lines and blank spaces of the ponderous pavilion of Mansart, one makes one's reflections upon the advantage, even in the least personal of the arts, of having something to say, and upon the stupidity of a taste which had ended by becoming an aggregation of negatives. Gaston's wing, taken by itself, has much of the bel air which was to belong to the architecture of Louis XIV. But taken in contrast to its flowering, laughing, living neighbor, it marks the difference between inspiration and calculation. We scarcely grudge it its place, however, for it adds a price to the rest of the chateau. We have entered the court, by the way, by jumping over the walls. The more orthodox method is to follow a modern terrace, which leads to the left from the side of the chateau that I began by speaking of, and passes round, ascending to a little square on a considerably higher level, which is not, like a very modern square, on which the back, as I have called it, looks out, a thoroughfare. This small empty place, oblong in form, at once bright and quiet, with a certain grass-grown look, offers an excellent setting to the entrance front of the palace, the wing of Louis XII. The restoration here has been lavish, but it was perhaps but an inevitable reaction against the injuries, still more lavish, by which the unfortunate building had long been overwhelmed. It had fallen into a state of ruinous neglect, relieved only by the misuse proceeding from successive generations of soldiers, for whom its charming chambers served as a barrack room. Whitewashed, mutilated, dishonored, the castle of Blois may be said to have escaped simply with its life. This is the history of Amboise as well, and is to a certain extent the history of Chambord. Delightful, at any rate, was the refreshed facade of Louis XII. As I stood and looked at it one bright September morning. In that soft, clear, merry light of Touraine, everything shows, everything speaks. Charming are the taste, the happy proportions, the color of this beautiful front, to which the new feeling for a purely domestic architecture, an architecture of security and tranquillity, in which art could indulge itself, gave an air of youth and gladness. It is true that for a long time to come the castle of Blois was neither very safe nor very quiet; but its dangers came from within, from the evil passions of its inhabitants, and not from siege or invasion. The front of Louis XII. Is of red brick, crossed here and there with purple, and the purple slate of the high roof, relieved with chimneys beautifully treated, and with the embroidered caps of pinnacles and arches, with the porcupine of Louis, the ermine and the festooned rope which formed the devices of Anne of Brittany. The tone of this rich-looking roof carries out the mild glow of the wall. The wide, fair windows look as if they had expanded to let in the rosy dawn of the Renaissance. Charming, for that matter, are the windows of all the chateaux of Touraine, with their squareness corrected, as it is not in the Tudor architecture, by the curve of the upper corners, which make this line look above the expressive aperture like a pencilled eyebrow. The low door of this front is crowned by a high, deep niche, in which, under a splendid canopy, stiffly astride of a stiffly draped charger, sits in profile an image of the good King Louis. Good as he had been, the father of his people, as he was called, I believe he remitted various taxes, he was not good enough to pass muster at the Revolution, and the effigy I have just described is no more than a reproduction of the primitive statue demolished at that period. Pass beneath it into the court, and the 16th century closes round you. It is a pardonable flight of fancy to say that the expressive faces of an age in which human passions lay very near the surface seem to look out at you from the windows, from the balconies, from the thick foliage of the sculpture. The portion of the wing of Louis XII. That looks toward the court is supported on a deep arcade. On your right is the wing erected by Francis I., the reverse of the massive building which you see on approaching the castle. This exquisite, this extravagant, this transcendent piece of architecture is the most joyous utterance of the French Renaissance. It is covered with an embroidery of sculpture in which every detail is worthy of the hand of a goldsmith. In the middle of it, or rather a little to the left, rises the famous winding staircase, plausibly, but I believe not religiously restored, which even the ages which most misused it must vaguely have admired. It forms a kind of a chiseled cylinder, with wide interstices, so that the stairs are open to the air. Every inch of this structure, of its balconies, its pillars, its great central columns, is wrought over with lovely images, strange and ingenious devices, prime among which is the great heraldic salamander of Francis I. The salamander is everywhere at Blois, over the chimneys, over the doors, on the walls. The whole quarter of the castle bears the stamp of that eminently pictorial prince. The running cornice along the top of the front is like, all unfolded, an elongated bracelet. The windows of the attic are like shrines for saints. The gargoyles, the medallions, the statuettes, the festoons, are like the elaboration of some precious cabinet rather than the details of a building exposed to the weather and to the ages. In the interior there is a great profusion of restoration, and it is all restoration in color. This has been, evidently, a work of great energy and cost, but it will easily strike you as overdone. The universal freshness is a discord, a false note. It seems to light up the dusky past with an unnatural glare. Begun in the reign of Louis Philippe, this terrible process, the more terrible always the more you admit that it has been necessary, has been carried so far that there is now scarcely a square inch of the interior that has the color of the past upon it. It is true that the place had been so coated over with modern abuse that something was needed to keep it alive. It is only perhaps a pity that the restorers, not content with saving its life, should have undertaken to restore its youth. The love of consistency in such a business is a dangerous lure. All the old apartments have been rechristened, as it were, the geography of the castle has been re-established, the guard-rooms, the bedrooms, the closets, the oratories have recovered their identity. Every spot connected with the murder of the Duke of Guise is pointed out by a small, shrill boy, who takes you from room to room, and who has learned his lesson in perfection. The place is full of Catherine de' Medici, of Henry III., of memories, of ghosts, of echoes, of possible evocations and revivals. It is covered with crimson and gold. The fireplaces and the ceilings are magnificent. They look like expensive sets at the Grand Opera. I should have mentioned that below in the court, the front of the wing of Gaston d'Orleans faces you as you enter, so that the place is a course of French history. Inferior in beauty and grace to the other portions of the castle, the wing is yet a nobler monument than the memory of Gaston deserves. The second of the sons of Henry IV., who was no more fortunate as a father than as a husband, younger brother of Louis XIII., and father of the great Mademoiselle, the most celebrated, most ambitious, most self-complacent, and most unsuccessful fille à marier in French history, passed in enforced retirement at the castle of Blois the close of a life of clumsy intrigues against Cardinal Richelieu, in which his rashness was only equalled by his pusillanimity, and his ill luck by his inaccessibility to correction, and which, after so many follies and shames, was properly summed up in the project begun, but not completed, of demolishing the beautiful habitation of his exile in order to erect a better one. With Gaston d'Orléans, however, who lived there without dignity, the history of the Chateau de Blois declines. Its interesting period is that of the wars of religion. It was the chief residence of Henry III, and the scene of the principal events of his depraved and dramatic reign. It has been restored more than enough, as I have said, by architects and decorators. The visitor, as he moves through its empty rooms, which are at once brilliant and ill lighted (they have not been refurnished), undertakes a little restoration of his own. His imagination helps itself from the things that remain. He tries to see the life of the 16th century in its form and dress, its turbulence, its passions, its loves and hates, its treacheries, falsities, touches of faith, its latitude of personal development, its presentation of the whole nature, its nobleness of costume, charm of speech, splendor of taste, unequaled picturesqueness. The picture is full of movement, of contrasted light and darkness, full altogether of abominations. Mixed up with them all is the great name of religion, so that the drama wants nothing to make it complete. What episode was ever more perfect looked at as a dramatic occurrence than the murder of the Duke of Guise? The insolent prosperity of the victim, the weakness, the vices, the terrors of the author of the deed, the perfect execution of the plot, the accumulation of horror in what followed it, give it, as a crime, a kind of immortal solidity. But we must not take the Chateau de Blois too hard. I went there, after all, by way of entertainment. If among these sinister memories your visit should threaten to prove a tragedy, there is an excellent way of removing the impression. You may treat yourself at Blois to a very cheerful after-piece. There is a charming industry practised there, and practised in charming conditions. Follow the bright little quay down the river till you get quite out of town, and reach the point where the road beside the Loire becomes sinuous and attractive, turns the corner of diminutive headlands, and makes you wonder what is beyond. Let not your curiosity induce you, however, to pass by a modest white villa which overlooks a stream, enclosed in a fresh little court. For here dwells an artist in faience. There is no sort of sign, and the place looks peculiarly private. But if you ring at the gate you will not be turned away. You will, on the contrary, be ushered upstairs into a parlor (there is nothing resembling a shop), encumbered with specimens of remarkably handsome pottery. The work is of the best, a careful reproduction of old forms, colors, devices, and the master of the establishment is one of those completely artistic types that are often found in France. His reception is as friendly as his work is ingenious, and I think it is not too much to say that you like the work the better because he has produced it. His vases, cups and jars, lamps, platters, plaques, with their brilliant glaze, their innumerable figures, their family likeness and wide variations, are scattered through his occupied rooms. They serve at once as his stock in trade and as household ornament. As we all know, this is an age of prose, of machinery, of wholesale production, of coarse and hasty processes. But one brings away from the establishment of the very intelligent M. Ulysse the sense of a less eager activity and a greater search for perfection. He has but a few workmen, and he gives them plenty of time. The place makes a little vignette, leaves an impression, the quiet white house in its garden on the road by the wide, clear river, without the smoke, the bustle, the ugliness of so much of our modern industry. It ought to gratify Mr. Ruskin. End of section 2.